You are calling us to follow. You are calling us to trust. You have seen all our tomorrows. Greater things are yet to come. You will lead us to new horizons.
With today's sermon in our series, Life Hacks, Pocket Tips from Proverbs for Better Living, here is Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
Earlier this year, my family and I went down to Tasmania. We went down to Hobart, and like anyone who goes on a trip, you want to make sure that you maximize your time and you want to maximize your dollar and all that sort of stuff. So we did a whole bunch of research before we went, trying to figure out where we should go and how far certain things were from Hobart, where we were going to be, and would we need a car, and all of those sorts of things to have the best kind of trip that we could as a family. And just like preparing for a trip requires a little bit of research and kind of working out what you're going to do and what things fit within your budget, so to succeed in the journey of life, it's often good to do some research as well, isn't it? And Proverbs are written with success in mind. It's not just about being successful on our holidays, it's also about being successful in everything that we do. And to some degree, the Proverbs are these short, pithy statements of truth that would, if you could expand them out and kind of write several chapters on them, would fit really nicely in any of the airport bookshops. You know, you get all the bestsellers, you know, all those leadership books, whether it be, you know, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie going back a ways, or Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or Jim Collins's Good to Great, or whatever it might be, whatever the kind of the hottest book out there right now is. That kind of wisdom, how to succeed in business, how to succeed in our relationships, how to succeed in our lives is essentially what the book of Proverbs is also about as well. But unlike books, which can kind of be easily digested as we read through them and we have ideas that are unpacked for us, because Proverbs are so short, because they're so generalized, we often need to kind of unpack them a little bit. Their economy of style and their compacted meaning has led some commentators to describe them as freeze-dried truths. They need to kind of be soaked a little bit. And so Proverbs often, in terms of accessing their wisdom, are a little bit more like a bath and a shower. A little bit more like chess than checkers, a little bit more like a degustation meal than fast food, right? You want to take your time, you want to linger over them a little bit, you want to explore them a little bit and try to get at the wisdom that they are presenting for us and the ways in which we can be successful. And the proverb that I want to look at this morning is in chapter 16, verse 25, which says this: "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death." There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. This same proverb is actually found again in chapter 14, verse 12. So either the editor just forgot that he'd already included it, or it's really important. And I think I'm happy with the latter rather than the former. And at first glance, this seems to say there are lots of ways out there, and choose wisely. There's a way that appears right, but in the end it leads to death. Some look good, some paths, some decisions, some ways forward look like the real deal, but in the end they aren't very good, so choose carefully. It made me think a little bit about some of our modern day contemporary proverbs, like don't judge a book by its cover, or all that glitters is not gold, or even that beauty is only skin deep. This whole idea of be careful about how you judge certain things because your initial judgment might not be right. But this proverb doesn't strike me as a simple proverb talking about being careful about judging by appearances. I mean, if you've ever judged a book by its cover, you know, you've been in the airport lounge and you've been looking for a book to read, and you just kind of pick one that looks good, you might end up being disappointed, right? Likewise, you might pick a book that doesn't look particularly flash, but you might be pleasantly surprised. But that's kind of the worst and best case scenario, isn't it? You're going to end up a little disappointed that the book wasn't as good as you hoped it might be, or pleasantly surprised that it was better than you thought. This proverb says there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. It doesn't lead to being mildly disappointed. It doesn't lead to kind of wishing you'd bought the other book. It's a little bit more significant here. And so I started thinking a little bit about why is it, or rather how, do we make choices about a way that appears to be right? So we've all faced decisions in our lives, haven't we? We've come to a particular point and we've had to decide one way or the other. We've had to make a decision about a job. We've had to make a decision about moving house. We've had to make a decision about where our children go to school. We've had to make a decision of some sort. And we tend to use kind of a very common set of parameters, really. So I began to think, so what are the sorts of ways that we would look at two decisions and think this one appears to be right? What is it that makes it appear right? And then there may be others, but here's the ones that I came up with. First of all, it seems to me that if everyone is doing it, then that might be right. Right? It certainly wouldn't lead to death because then not everyone would be doing it. You think you'd kind of figure that one out fairly quickly. So the whole idea of is a particular way, is a particular decision a popular one? Right? Now, we also know that sometimes the majority are not right at all, right? Just because everyone's doing something doesn't make it right. But popularity or whether it's a common trend can actually influence our own decision making about what appears to be right. Lots of people in our circle of influence or family members or friends or people we respect are doing something, well, that kind of lends some weight to that decision. It makes it appear to be right. On the other hand, there might be times when we make a decision based on whether something is congruent with our dreams and our aspirations. Now, our dreams and aspirations are also shaped by our wider community and culture. But, when you're given a choice between one way or another, and the other way actually presents you with something that matches where you want to end up, you make the decision because if I make this decision, it will help me get to where I want to go. It'll help me achieve the things that I hope to achieve. It will move me in the direction of achieving my goals and dreams, whatever it might be. We can sometimes make decisions on the basis that things coincide with our skills and our competencies and our availability. We make a decision between two circumstances based on whether we're better at one thing than the other. We choose between jobs based on the satisfaction that they might give us over the other. We make decisions based on what we feel that we are competent and able to do. We might make decisions even on the basis of how close something is to our homes or lifestyle choices, whatever it might be. And sometimes we also make decisions or we believe something is right when it is accompanied by coincidences that suggest a higher purpose or destiny. I don't know about you. I don't know if there are any statistics on this. I doubt that there are. I haven't done any research about it. But I'm often struck by how often people's stories about how they end up where they end up include a coincidence. I just started thinking about changing my occupation, and then out of the blue, I got a call from someone I hadn't talked to for 20 years. And that led to this, that led to that, led to this, and now I'm in a new job. Have you heard those sorts of stories? It's remarkable to me how often people make a decision, not just on a coincidence, but that has a coincidence in it. And can I just say that all of these, whether it's about popularity, congruence with our dreams and aspirations, some sort of alignment with our skills and abilities, or those little coincidences, all of those are pretty reasonable ways to decide whether a way is right. If you came to me and said, I'd like your advice, and I've made a decision, and you explained the two choices before you, and then you talked about the fact that the decision that you've made lined up with where you wanted to be as an individual or as a family, that it matched your skill set, that there was kind of a trend in that direction, and that you really felt that there had been a few coincidences that had affirmed it for you, I think my response would be, that sounds like a pretty good decision. I don't think that I would question your methodology. I don't think I'd question those assumptions. That sounds like a pretty good way to make a decision. So, is this proverb saying that there's no guarantee for success. Right? There's a way that appears to be right, so try your best to make it, but in the end, it might lead to death. You just don't know. It's kind of a bit of a potluck, right? Just have a go and, maybe it'll work out and maybe it won't. It's helpful to know the risks beforehand, but basically the best you can do is, have a swing. And if that's the case, of course, then this isn't much wisdom. It doesn't help us make choices at all. We might as well get one of those magic 8 balls and kind of look at the answer and decide our life based on that more than anything else. And Scripture, of course, interprets Scripture. Right? Scripture interprets Scripture. And so when we come to a text, any text, we need to consider, what does the rest of Scripture have to say about it? And if we start talking about decisions as basically down to fate or luck, we kind of bump into a bit of a theological problem. Because we don't believe, really, in fate or luck, some sort of force out there that determines whether we're successful or not, regardless of how we live or what we do or those sorts of things. We believe this is our Father's world. And on top of that, we believe that God has made the world in certain ways in order that we can live according to those patterns. We can live according to those moral patterns. And it struck me that Proverbs as a whole, as well as Scripture, is not silent on the way that leads to death. Right? So if you read all the way through Proverbs, you'll actually encounter a whole bunch of ways, a whole bunch of paths that lead to death. So, for example, sexual immorality, according to the book of Proverbs, leads to death. Right? Whether you look in chapter 2, or in chapter 5, or in chapter 7, or wherever it might be, you hear these sorts of things that the feet of, and he's talking about an adulterous woman in this case, and getting engaged with her, is that her feet go down to death, her steps lead straight to the grave. This is the kind of language that's associated with sexual immorality in the book of Proverbs. You find the same when it talks about ill-gotten gain. Ill-gotten treasures, in chapter 10, verse 2, says, have no lasting value, but righteousness delivers from death. Wickedness also leads to death, according to the book of Proverbs, in all sorts of different places. Lack of discipline leads to death, in particular, the lack of discipline that is associated with laziness. Lack of prudence, making kind of wise decisions, leads to death. An untamed tongue leads to death. Folly leads to death. There are, according to Scripture, according to Proverbs alone, at least 7 pathways that will lead you to death. Take your pick. So when you come back to this proverb then, it raises a pretty obvious question, doesn't it? There's a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. And Proverbs tells us that the ways that lead to death are those ways marked by sexual immorality, wickedness, folly, recklessness, negligence. How could you miss that? How could you think that that way which would lead to death was actually right? What would have to happen for you to look at that way that leads to death and go, it looks right? There's a way that appears right, but it leads to death? How do you get that wrong? How do you get that wrong? How do you think that the street that says dead end suddenly is going to open into an ongoing street? This is the question. You'd have to be a fool, wouldn't you, to get it so wrong? You'd have to be an utter fool to think that a way that would lead to death was actually right. In fact, in chapter 12, verse 15, and in a couple of other places as well, you read these sorts of words. The way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. The way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. And a couple of the commentators that I read in relationship to Proverbs 16:25 suggest, in fact, that our proverb is actually a proverb about decisions that are made in isolation. That the way The way in which a decision leads to death, but we think it appears right, is if the only person we're listening to is ourselves or other fools. So all the way through the book of Proverbs, and this is again true all the way through Scripture, listening is critical to obtaining wisdom. It's critical to obtaining wisdom. In the opening section, in the prologue of the book of Proverbs, there's a couple of points when Lady Wisdom invites, she calls out to people, "How long will you listen to fools? Listen to my words, be wise, live." And likewise, Lady Folly calls out and gives essentially the same invitation. Who are you going to listen to? Listening becomes critical. And we need to listen to other people, but we need to listen to the right sorts of people, don't we? Again, Proverbs 17, verse 4 says that a wicked person listens to deceitful lips, and a liar pays attention to a destructive tongue. So it's not just a matter of listening to lots of people. You're all familiar with online filter bubbles. I think by now, the algorithms that are used by social media sites and whatnot to end up filtering out stuff that is opposite to the things that we're always looking at. And we can end up in what they call an online filter bubble, where all the voices that might disagree with us are filtered out. And all we encounter in the big wide world of the internet are people who think the same way we do. We end up listening to lots of people, but are they wise? Well, I guess that depends on the algorithm you use, doesn't it, right? If you want a biblical example, I think the one that stands out for me is the example of King Rehoboam. Rehoboam was Solomon's son, and when Solomon died and Rehoboam became king, the people of Israel came to Rehoboam and they said, essentially, your father was hard. He required forced labor and high taxes and all those sorts of things. Will you be gentle to us? And so Rehoboam said, well, give me a couple days to think about it, which was wise. And then he spoke to his father's advisors and said, what do you think? Which was also wise. And his father's advisors said, listen, if you respond gently to the people of Israel, they will be yours forever. Then he went and listened to somebody else, which I suppose might have been wise, except that they happened to be the young men that he grew up with. And he said, what do you guys think? And they said, oh, listen, that would be a huge mistake. You don't want the people to think you're a pushover. You don't want people to think that you're a wuss. You don't want people to think that you're going to be easily kind of dealt with. You want to come out hard with a show of strength. Well, I guess who Rehoboam listened to? He listened to his friends. And so when the people of Israel returned, he said, you think my dad was bad? Wait till you get a load of me. Right? And the end result was civil war and the loss of the kingdom. Foolishness, folly from taking advice from the wrong sorts of people. So this proverb that states that there's a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death, tells us something really important about the world that God has made and how we can live successfully in it. And here's the critical piece. God has made the world in such a way that success comes from counsel and advice. Now, here's what I think is quite significant about that. It's not just that we are better together. It's not just that none of us are complete or self-sufficient or completely independent. I think what's important to recognize is that we were never meant to be independent and self-sufficient. In the garden, right? Remember when God creates the whole world, it's all good, and the first thing that is not good in the world isn't the fall, it's that the man is alone. Even in the Garden of Eden, Adam, humanity was not designed to be self-sufficient. It is not a factor of our sin that leads us to need other people. It's not the fact that we're fallen and that we're no longer in kind of our Edenic perfection that means we need other people. We need other people because God made the world that way. Before the fall, we were designed, you and I were designed to need other people. Self-sufficiency is not heaven. We will always be interdependent. We will always need one another. That's how God made the world before sin came into the world. And therefore, success in the world, Success in the world requires that we gain counsel and advice from others. Now, the result of sin in the world is that there are fools, and there are those who are wicked. And there are those who would encourage and urge us to ill-gotten gain or to sexual immorality. Because of sin in the world, we end up lacking the discipline or the prudence to live well. And so we require other people to correct us, to give to us the insights that we need to be successful. If you want to know whether or not you are on the path to wisdom, here's a simple test. How do you respond to correction? How do you respond to correction? Because the wise love correction. They love to be told that what they are doing is foolish. They love to be challenged and instructed in the ways of wisdom. How do you respond to correction? If you embrace it, well, you are on the path to wisdom. If not, well, you can do the math on that one. Wisdom is a team, it's a family, it's a network. And our individualism cuts against that. And so if we are going to, because so often we make decisions on our own or with those people closest to us, if we are going to avoid ultimately the deceitfulness of our own hearts, because we can convince ourselves that a way that leads to death is actually right, can't we? We can actually deceive ourselves. We tell ourselves all sorts of stories. We give all sorts of justifications. We have all sorts of arguments for and against. And we can actually convince ourselves that the way that we are going to take is right, even when it's not. If we are going to avoid that deceitfulness, then we need to set aside the myth of self-sufficiency, to set aside the myth of independence and choose to lean into wise counsel. Because this is wisdom. This is how God made the world. He designed the world so that we would always need one another. That we would always need other perspectives, that we would always need the guidance and wisdom and experience from those around us to help us to make not only decisions that are good for us, that are helpful for us and our families, but ultimately that will lead to life, that will be marked by purity and by wisdom and by discipline and by discretion, in order that our decisions might ultimately lead us to life. So, there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. The way of a fool appears right to them. So let us be careful who it is that we listen to. Let us live wisely. Let us live together in order that together we might make the decisions that lead to life. Another pocket tip from Proverbs for better living.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
It is of profound significance that God created us, even before the fall, to be with other people, to need one another. And so now when we grapple with the challenges of living in a broken and fallen world, it's even more important, because it is possible that we might look at a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. We need one another. We need their wise counsel and experience to avoid making those sorts of, tragic decisions. I trust that you've been challenged and encouraged again to find wise counsel, to listen to it in order that you might find success in all that you do. God bless. We hope to see you again real soon.